Welcome back to today's verdict. I'm your host and trial attorney, John Orcutt, the director of advocacy from Bike New York. John, thanks for being
My
here
pleasure.
today.
Great to be here.
Listen, I want you to know, just for the record, I'm a bicyclist. How do you say that? I love using my bike throughout the city of New York. I'm biking regularly on the streets. I'm always in the bike lane, just want you to know. So I'm a big fan of bikes, but I also own a car. And I also see that there is always a little bit of a pull between the two in terms of rights and obligations. When I took an exam years ago to learn how to drive, I don't remember being asked any questions about rules of the road involving bikes. Am I correct?
Yeah, most likely. I think if you went deep into the rules that they give you, you might find something, but I'm sure it wasn't on your test.
So there are two different ways to get a driver's license, if I remember correctly. Both you have to satisfy. One is a written test and one is a road test. Let's start with the written test. With respect to the written test, are there questions about bicycles on there?
Well, there's just been legislation signed by Governor Hochul and the state of New York that will start to work those questions into the test.
And what types of questions are we talking about?
I don't know exactly. But it will relate to I would guess safe passing distance for a car around a bike, whether a bicycle is permitted on the road, where they should be, those kinds of things. And it may be tricky because the city of New York has rules that are more detailed in that regard than, say, a place up, in central New York like Syracuse.
What was the impetus for this bill?
Basically that there's organized bike advocates who are working on these issues and see these holes in the system. I mean, one of the things that's and I think this is a good step, but I'm not sure it's going to be some kind of decisive step, because, and you may remember from taking driver's ed and getting the license, it's pretty perfunctory. And if you look around the world to developed countries that have far fewer traffic deaths and crashes than we do, we're really an outlier as a rich country in terms of in the United States. It's something like per 100,000 people population, you get about 12 traffic deaths. And in a country like the United Kingdom, which is not like super bike friendly in terms of road design, it's about 4. And part of that is that they just take the driver's responsibility thing very seriously. And in a lot of the United States, it's kind of perfunctory. And there have been articles written about, people who went to driving school in New York, and, the verdict was that it's kind of a joke. And so the training can be very, very low level. And I think the state's tracking of driver behavior is also pretty perfunctory. And, I tend to view the state DMV as mostly a revenue vehicle for the state, rather than somebody who's keeping track of what's going on our roads.
Well, let me ask you a question, because this may change attitudes for new drivers. But what about the rest of us who never have to see a driver's exam again?
Well, a great point. I mean, and that's, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, that's going to be the vast majority of people on the road as new drivers trickle in. But also, again, to the extent people pay attention, they're asked to pay attention, and the test is pretty unrigorous, maybe this doesn't have much of an effect at all. And, it's not just the state of New York, it's a national issue. And there's a lot of other issues around driver's responsibility in terms of how insurance works, in terms of how law enforcement works, that tend to keep drivers being not very responsible for much, even when something really bad happens.
What seems to be the biggest offense that vehicles seem to commit when it comes to bike safety?
Well, I mean, you mentioned that you're out there on your bike a lot, and I would be shocked if you didn't agree that you routinely encounter cars and trucks parked in the bike lanes.
I see that all the time. All the time when I go down, it could be everything from, I do drive a fair amount in Manhattan. So if I'm driving, let's say downtown on Second Avenue, yes, you see people they park in the bike lanes. Yes.
Yeah, so it's pretty ubiquitous, and there's very little enforcement against it, relative to the scale of the offense. And so that can be dangerous in terms of pushing a cyclist out into traffic, because you need to keep going. And there are cases where there have been fatalities related to people, pushed out into traffic because of a parked car in the bike lane. One on Central Park West, I can think of a couple of years ago where that happened. But the other offenses are kind of failure to yield, which is just acknowledging that you're there and that you're not encased in metal as a bicycle rider. And this is a huge issue for pedestrians as well. Look, the city's made progress. When I started working on this stuff in the early 90s, there were about 700 traffic deaths in the city of New York, which is pretty shocking, right? That's like 2 people a day killed on the street. This past year, 2022, the preliminary total for fatalities is about 253. So it's come down a lot, but it's taken a long time. And other places around the world are making these things come down a lot faster. And a big pedestrian, transit-oriented, dense city like New York should be doing better than we are.
I mentioned earlier, I also drive. So I do see bicyclists absolutely not following the rules of the road. See it all the time. I see they don't stop at stoplights. They never stop at stop signs. I don't know so much about them cutting across roads, but the big thing for me is they don't stop at the stoplights. They don't wait at stoplights. Right. And that is dangerous for pedestrians who are crossing, especially in Manhattan. All the time, I tell my 12-year-old son, I said, just because it's a red light, don't worry about the cars. You worry about the bicyclists that are coming through, especially the delivery men. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a symptom of just the way we treat traffic rules in general in the city. And bikes don't kill very many people. It's pretty rare that actually happens, but it does happen occasionally. But it definitely contributes to a sense that the streets are kind of out of control. And you see pedestrians, like when you do stop, they're kind of shocked and give you a wave sometimes when you stop and you yield to them, because they're not used to that happening. So we need overall to reclaim that kind of sense of order and to just have some rules in the city. And I just feel like we really have moved away from that gradually to the point where it's very common now just to see a car parked on a corner where it blocks 2 ramps for wheelchairs and older folks. And I didn't even see that kind of thing like 4 or 5 years ago. But just you stand at any intersection for 30 minutes and just watch, and it's pretty shocking how many cars will go through a red light. A lot of it is they stop and then they go around the corner, and a lot of the bikes who run through are kind of sort of jaywalking it, but some are not. Some are reckless and they blast through, and that's scary. And and it just contributes to that sense that no one's paying the rules, paying attention to the rules, so why should I? And I think that has crept into the culture of the streets, in a pretty dramatic way. And there's some kind of a COVID effect that we've been seeing, especially with car drivers, where
how so?
The crash rates just went up pretty dramatically starting in the second half of 2020 country. And what's interesting is pedestrian fatalities, which is kind of a gauge of, sort of cooperation on the streets, have been kind of plateaued, but motorist fatalities have gone up pretty dramatically in the last 3 years. And a lot of that's on the highways, just people being reckless and crashing. And I don't know what the psychology is, but it's pretty noticeable, both nationally and here in the city.
One of the things I do remember from law school is that you have rights and you have privileges, and driving was always a privilege. It wasn't a right; it was a privilege.
Right.
I wonder what we can do to enforce the privilege. In other words, to force drivers now to understand the rules of the road with regard to pedestrians and with regard to bicyclists. is there, you know, I don't know what we could do. Can we send out tests, you know, like we would like a census, something to get people to review those things? Are those do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the fact that we have this new law about the driving test and bike pedestrian issues, you know, it shows that there are policymakers paying attention to this stuff. And, you know, and there have been other steps, but some more dramatic. I mean, the city now has a law where, you know, if you get a certain number of speed camera tickets, the city can actually impound your car and force you to take remedial classes. The city administration has been really slow to move that out and to scale it into something that will actually have an impact. It's not having an impact at this point. And
the problem with that is that you don't know who's driving the car. You know, with the speed cameras, you could have 10 of them, but 2 was your mom, 2 was your dad, 2 was your son.
So the enforcement is kind of focused on the vehicle in this case, and the owner of the vehicle, which, you know, maybe not as direct, but the state's not, you know, tracking the drivers in the same way. So it's the city's doing something, and city policymakers are trying to do something, but then, you know, the city implementers are not really doing it. So there are those kinds of things. I think we need a sort of reckoning around this issue of responsibility, as you were saying. But that means taking a look at how insurance works. It means taking a real look at state laws, and trying to recover that. And I don't think we've done that yet.
You know, I will tell you, in my practice, you know, we do a fair amount of personal injury work, and there are many times that these bicyclists get injured by vehicles, and we bring actions against the vehicles. But there are also times where pedestrians are hit by bicyclists, and there's no recovery because there's no insurance that's covering the bike. If it's one thing, if it's a restaurant that's DoorDash, it's delivering, then you may be able to do something. But if it's just your average, you know, man or woman or kid who's riding a bike, you know, I always would like to see some kind of mandatory insurance for people who ride bikes, because you could just as well cause an accident.
Right. Yeah. And I again, I think this whole system needs an overhaul and a reckoning, and it'd be worth looking at how those kind of issues work in other countries where they do take this stuff much more seriously. And I wouldn't tell you, say, riding around London. I haven't been there in a couple of years, but the bike riding is very heavy.
Yeah.
You do see a lot greater sort of queuing at lights kind of behavior. Not universal by any measure, but certainly more than we see here. And so there is some kind of system there that is working to influence behavior.
Well, John, I want to thank you very much. Very informative. I'm a biker, just like you. We've got to keep our fellow bikers safe. And hopefully you'll come back the next couple of months and give us a little bit of an update.
Thanks. Really, really interesting conversation.
It's my pleasure. All right, stay with us. Today's Verdict has so much more right after this.